Case 1. Kelsey Turner. On the morning of March 7, 2019, Las Vegas Metropolitan Police officers responded to a report of an abandoned vehicle on State Route 147 near mile marker 14, a stretch of desert road running along the edge of Lake Mead National Recreation Area. The car, a blue Mercedes-Benz C300, had been sitting long enough to draw attention. When officers approached and opened the trunk, what they found inside would pull the investigation in a direction that eventually reached directly into the curated world of social media modeling. Kelsey Nicole Turner was born on May 5, 1993, in Norfolk, Virginia, and spent her formative years in Jonesboro, Arkansas, where she attended Nettleton High School before enrolling at Arkansas State University. She eventually relocated to Salinas, California, and then to Las Vegas, Nevada, in building a modeling portfolio that placed her in the pages of Playboy Italia and Maxim. On Instagram, under the handle Bad Barbie, she cultivated a following of tens of thousands. Images of a young woman living well, traveling, dressing expensively, inhabiting a life that looked, from the outside, as though it had been carefully designed and carefully earned. She was 25 years old at the time investigators first heard her name. To anyone encountering her profile without context, there was nothing to question and nothing to examine. The lifestyle appeared to speak for itself. The man in the trunk of her Mercedes was Dr. Thomas Kirk Burchard, a 71-year-old child psychiatrist who had practiced for decades at the community hospital of the Monterey Peninsula and lived in Salinas with his longtime partner, Judy Earp. According to investigators and court records, Burchard and Turner had known one another for approximately 2 years, during which time he had financially supported her lifestyle to a degree later estimated at somewhere between $300,000 and $500,000, covering rent at properties in both Salinas and Las Vegas, vehicle expenses, and a range of personal expenditures. By early 2019, evidence later suggested that arrangement had reached a breaking point. Burchard, according to Earp's subsequent testimony, told her he was traveling to Las Vegas to confront Turner directly. His exact words, as Earp recalled them, indicated he had grown suspicious, that he felt he had been misled, that he needed to see certain things for himself. He flew to Las Vegas. He never returned. Surveillance footage and subsequent witness accounts placed Burchard at the home Turner shared with her then-boyfriend, John Logan Kennison, and a roommate named Diana Nicole Pena, on approximately March 1, 2019. What followed inside that house was reconstructed primarily through physical evidence and the detailed testimony Pena later provided to investigators. According to that account, a confrontation occurred after Turner discovered messages on Burchard's phone, communications she interpreted as a threat to her custody of her children. The altercation escalated inside the home. Prosecutors later argued that Turner directed Kennison to physically attack Burchard. Kennison, according to the evidence presented, struck Burchard repeatedly in the head with a baseball bat. The Clark County Coroner's Office later confirmed that Burchard died of multiple blunt force injuries to the head. Injuries consistent, the coroner noted, with a pattern of repeated blows. He was, at some point during or after the attack, still alive enough that Pena, according to her own testimony, heard him speak. After the fact, Turner allegedly contacted individuals asking for assistance cleaning the house. Physical evidence at the scene, cleaning supplies, traces of blood in the garage, indicated a sustained effort to remove evidence of what had occurred. Burchard's body was then loaded into the trunk of Turner's Mercedes. The car was driven out into the desert and abandoned on State Route 147. Turner, Kennison, and Pena subsequently fled Las Vegas for California. When Judy Earp reported Burchard missing after he failed to return from Las Vegas, noting that he would never have abandoned his patients without making prior arrangements. Law enforcement began constructing a timeline. That timeline led directly to the abandoned vehicle on March 7th. Inside the trunk alongside Burchard's body, investigators documented the baseball bat, bath towels, and physical evidence that would later be confirmed as forensically significant. The investigation accelerated rapidly. Turner was located and arrested by FBI agents and Las Vegas Metropolitan Police on March 21st, 2019, in Stockton, California. Pena turned herself in separately, and Kennison was taken into custody on April 17th. Fingerprint analysis, DNA evidence, and the physical items recovered from the scene formed the backbone of what prosecutors later described as a case built on interconnected forensic detail. Pena, who agreed to cooperate with investigators, became a key witness, providing a first-person account of the final hours of Burchard's life and the events that followed. She pleaded guilty to accessory to murder in June 2019. In the courtroom, the legal process played out across 3 years. Turner initially entered a not guilty plea and maintained that position through the bulk of the pretrial period. In November 2022, with Kennison having already pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and conspiracy, receiving a sentence of 18 to 45 years in July of that year, Turner entered an Alford plea to second-degree murder. Under an Alford plea, a defendant formally acknowledges that the evidence is sufficient to support a conviction while simultaneously maintaining their personal claim of innocence. The plea resolved the murder charge. A conspiracy count was dropped as part of the agreement. Defense arguments during the sentencing phase characterized Kennison as the primary actor and suggested Turner had been manipulated rather than directing. Prosecutors, by contrast, presented her as the architect of what occurred, the individual whose response to the confrontation with Burchard set the violence in motion and whose instructions shaped what followed. On January 10, 2023, Clark County District Court Judge Carly Kearney sentenced Kelsey Turner to the maximum term available under the plea agreement, 10 to 25 years in Nevada State Prison, with credit for the 1,371 days she had already served. The judge imposed the upper end of the range. Turner made no statement at sentencing. Parole eligibility under Nevada's guidelines falls no earlier than the 10-year mark, placing her earliest possible release consideration in March 2029. She is currently incarcerated at the Florence McClure Women's Correctional Center in Nevada. The Instagram account that had documented her carefully constructed life went dark in 2019 and has not been updated since. The body was found because a car was left in the desert on a public road. That's where the thread began to unravel. Not with a confession, not with a tip, but with a vehicle that had simply been there too long. It is a strange and clarifying detail that a life built on image, on projection, on the visible construction of wealth and beauty, ended its public chapter not with a post, but with an abandoned object on an empty road in the Nevada heat. The next case involves a man who became famous for an act of apparent heroism, and whose public image collapsed under the weight of something no viral moment could contain. Case 2. Caleb Kai McGillvary. Clark Township Police in Union County, New Jersey, arrived at a residence on Starlight Drive on May 13, 2013, in response to a wellness check after neighbors reported concern. And what they found inside transformed a routine call into a homicide investigation that reached back across state lines, across 3 months, and directly into one of the most viewed viral clips on the internet. Caleb Lawrence McGillvary was born September 3, 1988, in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, when he had no fixed address, no conventional employment, and no identification documents. A self-described nomad who moved through North America by hitchhiking and identified publicly as living what he called a home-free life. In February 2013, he became a household name overnight. A local Fox affiliate in Fresno, California, filmed him describing how he had intervened when the driver of a vehicle he was riding in deliberately struck a utility worker and then attacked a bystander. The clip spread to every major platform within hours. He appeared on national television. Law enforcement in Fresno reviewed the incident and determined his actions had been legally justified. The public had been given a story, and the story appeared complete. Nothing visible in his public profile indicated anything further to examine. 3 months later, where investigators were examining something entirely different. On May 10th, 2013, McGillvary and 73-year-old Joseph Galfi, a veteran who had reached the rank of major and had practiced law for more than 4 decades at the firm of Kochanski, Barron and Galfi, PC, in Rahway, New Jersey, met in Times Square in New York City. They had no prior documented relationship. Within approximately 24 hours, Galfi was back at his home on Starlight Drive in Clark. Within approximately 48 hours, he was dead. Investigators responding to the wellness check on May 13th documented extensive injuries across his face, head, neck, chest, and arms. Multiple fractures to the neck and skull, 4 broken ribs, and severe contusions and abrasions. He was found partially clothed. The injuries, as the Union County medical examiner later confirmed, were consistent with a sustained, high-force assault, not a single reactive blow. McGillvary, meanwhile, had not remained in Clark. After leaving the area, he cut the long hair that had made him instantly recognizable during his weeks of viral fame. Surveillance footage placed him in and around Times Square during the days surrounding the killing. A note bearing his name and contact information, along with a train ticket receipt showing Galfi had purchased a ticket for him, was recovered from inside the residence. Cell phone data established a trail of his movements. Investigators assembled the case quickly. He was located at a Starbucks in Philadelphia when an employee recognized him from coverage of the case and contacted law enforcement. He was taken into custody at a nearby bus terminal without incident. What followed was one of the longer pretrial processes in Union County's recent history, nearly 6 years between arrest and trial. McGillvary's original legal representation changed over that period. Court records documented him as hostile and non-compliant on multiple occasions, and he spent parts of the pretrial period studying law and filing civil actions he claimed were related to the investigation. When the trial finally commenced in Union County Superior Court before Judge Robert Kirsch, it ran for 4 weeks. The prosecution built its case on the surveillance record, the cell phone data, the forensic evidence gathered at the Starlight Drive residence, and the medical examiner's testimony establishing the nature and extent of Galfi's injuries. The defense presented a self-defense argument. McGillvary, who took the stand in his own defense, alleged that Galfi had drugged and assaulted him in his sleep, and that his response had been reactive and protective. Prosecutors met that argument with 3 layers of counter-evidence: the number and distribution of injuries, which the medical examiner testified were inconsistent with a reactive act; inconsistencies in McGillvary's account of his movements and the location of items he claimed were at the scene; and the documented sequence of his departure from New Jersey, including cutting his hair, that prosecutors characterized as a deliberate attempt to alter his appearance and avoid identification. McGillvary proved a difficult witness, engaging in extended disputes with the assistant prosecutor during cross-examination. Judge Kirsch warned him on multiple occasions to remain controlled, but the jury deliberated across 2 days before returning a verdict of guilty on the charge of first-degree murder on April 1st, 2019. At sentencing on May 30th, 2019, McGillvary addressed the court and characterized the entire proceeding as a sham, declaring his intent to pursue the conviction further from inside prison. Judge Kirsch responded with language that became widely reported. He described McGillvary as crafty, cunning, disingenuous, and manipulative. And then he calculated, explicitly and on the record, what the sentence meant in real terms. The sentence was 57 years. Under New Jersey law, McGillvary would be required to serve 85% before becoming eligible for parole, placing his earliest possible consideration around October 2061, at which point he would be approximately the same age Galfi was on the day he died. At least the judge made that arithmetic plain and deliberate. All subsequent appeals have been denied. McGillvary is currently incarcerated at New Jersey State Prison. The viral clip from Fresno that made his name famous showed a man prepared to use decisive physical force to protect a stranger. The same quality that generated millions of views in February 2013 was the same quality prosecutors argued had nothing heroic behind it 3 months later on Starlight Drive. What the camera had captured was a performance. What it never captured was everything that came after. The next case turns on something equally invisible, a hidden life sustained not in a single violent moment, but across more than a year of deliberate concealment, playing out entirely behind the camera of a beauty channel with thousands of loyal subscribers. Case 3, Alyssa Dayvault. The investigation began not because someone went looking, but because a body gave its own evidence. On December 5th, 2018, Alyssa Ann Dayvault was admitted to Grand Strand Regional Medical Center in North Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, experiencing severe vaginal bleeding, a dangerously low hemoglobin count requiring a blood transfusion, and a life-threatening infection. Examining physicians documented an undelivered placenta and umbilical cord, physical evidence of a full-term pregnancy. There was no infant. When hospital staff could not account for the child, they contacted the North Myrtle Beach police. A routine medical intake had become the first thread of a criminal investigation. Alyssa Dayvault had grown up in the orbit of social media's beauty culture. He's building a YouTube channel focused on makeup tutorials and cosmetic content that positioned her as a cheerful, relatable presence among an audience of subscribers who knew her as a knowledgeable and personable creator. She lived in North Myrtle Beach, where she was raising 2 daughters, aged 8 and 10 at the time of the events in question, and was in a relationship with a man named Chris Madichin. To her followers, her family, and to Madichin's family, who described welcoming her with open arms, she appeared open and present. She had no prior criminal record. Nothing in the visible surface of her life pointed in any particular direction. She was, in the estimation of everyone around her, exactly who she appeared to be. She was not. Over the course of approximately 13 months, across 2017 and 2018, where Dayvault had concealed 2 full-term pregnancies, from Madichin, from his family, from her own family, and from anyone else connected to her life. The first pregnancy reached its conclusion in November 2017, when Dayvault gave birth alone in her apartment in North Myrtle Beach. According to evidence later presented by prosecutors, the infant, a girl, was alive and breathing after delivery, with Dayvault subsequently acknowledging that the baby's umbilical cord had been wrapped around her neck at birth. No medical attention was summoned. Dayvault placed the newborn into a sealed trash bag and discarded her in a trash can outside the residence. The second pregnancy ended in December 2018, when Dayvault again gave birth alone at her home. In a videotaped statement to North Myrtle Beach, police conducted during the December 2018 hospitalization, she initially denied any pregnancy entirely, stating on camera that she would have been overjoyed to have been pregnant and that she was confused by the medical findings. Within minutes of that denial, she changed course and admitted what had occurred. She described losing consciousness during the delivery, regaining awareness approximately 15 minutes later to find the baby unresponsive and placing the infant into a sealed trash bag. The baby boy's body was subsequently located in a trash can outside her home. Forensic pathologist Nicholas Batalis examined the body of the infant boy and testified at trial that the child had been carried to full term and showed every indication of being healthy at the time of delivery. Critically, pathology testing identified the presence of meconium, a newborn's first waste, inside the sealed trash bag alongside the body. The medical significance of that finding was significant. Its presence indicated that the infant had been alive and breathing inside the bag after it was sealed, with the oxygen supply progressively exhausted as he remained enclosed. The manner of death was not blunt trauma or any external physical act of violence. It was the environment created by the sealed bag itself. Investigators also recovered evidence pertaining to the November 2017 infant, building a parallel count from that earlier birth. Dayvault had been charged with 2 counts of homicide by child abuse. The legal proceedings reached their most unusual juncture in October 2020, like when Dayvault's trial date arrived in Horry County, and she did not. She failed to appear, entirely absent from proceedings that would determine her fate. A bench warrant was issued. She was tried in absentia under South Carolina procedure. Her defense attorney, Shard Crawford, arguing in her absence that concealing a pregnancy was not a criminal act, that Dayvault had no prior record, and that mental health context should be considered. The prosecution presented its forensic evidence, its pathology testimony, and its documentation of Dayvault's own videotaped admission. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning verdicts of guilty on both counts of homicide by child abuse on October 15, 2020. The sentence was sealed pending her appearance before the court. She turned herself in the following day, at sentencing on November 5, 2020, before Circuit Judge Stephen H. John of South Carolina's 15th Judicial Circuit. Dayvault addressed the court, weeping, apologizing to her daughters, and to the family of Chris Madichin, who had been entirely unaware of both pregnancies. Judge John sentenced her to 40 years in prison on each count, with the 2 terms running concurrently. Under South Carolina law, the offense carried no parole eligibility. The Chief Deputy Solicitor confirmed that the sentence was structured as a day-for-day term. Judge John stated explicitly that the absence from trial had played no role in the sentence. The evidence and the facts alone had determined the outcome. Dayvault rejected a plea agreement that would have resulted in a 30 to 35-year sentence before trial. She is currently serving her sentence within the South Carolina prison system with no possibility of parole. Her YouTube channel, where subscribers once watched her demonstrate blending techniques and product reviews, had no knowledge of any of it. She had uploaded content through the period in question. The gap between what the camera captured and what the camera never saw was in this case everything. Where this case asked how a life could be so completely divided, the next case asks something equally unresolvable: how someone whose public image was built entirely on physical vitality and athletic achievement had running entirely beneath it and invisible to everyone who followed him, a psychological deterioration that ended in one of the most extreme acts of violence Florida recorded in a decade. Case 4. Austin Harrouff. 4 days before Martin County Sheriff's deputies responded to Southeast Kokomo Lane near Tequesta, Florida, on the night of August 15, 2016, the Instagram and YouTube accounts belonging to Austin Harrouff were updated for the last time. The content was fitness-focused, forward-looking, and entirely consistent with everything his followers had come to expect. What the accounts could not document, and what investigators would spend years reconstructing, was the deterioration that had been accelerating in the weeks between those final posts and the moment deputies arrived at a garage on the edge of a residential neighborhood and encountered something that offered no immediate investigative framework. Austin Kelly Harrouff was born December 21, 1996, in Palm Beach County, Florida, and grew up in Jupiter. He attended Suncoast Community High School in nearby Riviera Beach, where he competed in both football and wrestling, earning all conference honors in Palm Beach County for wrestling in 2014 and enrolling in the school's demanding International Baccalaureate program simultaneously, a combination that positioned him in the estimation of teammates and faculty as someone with both physical and academic potential. He arrived at Florida State University in Tallahassee as a sophomore in 2015, joining the Alpha Delta Phi fraternity and redirecting his athletic energy entirely into bodybuilding. Under the handle Austifrosty, he built YouTube and Instagram profiles centered on workout philosophy, natural fitness approaches, and tracks from a mixtape he had recorded and uploaded independently. His last upload came 4 days before August 15th. What neither his followers nor his fraternity contacts could observe was what digital forensics later recovered from his devices. A documented trail of internet searches beginning in early August 2016, including queries about auditory hallucinations, schizophrenia, demonic possession, and centaurs. Family members told investigators that Harrouff had been describing himself as immortal, as possessing supernatural abilities, and as responsible for protecting the household from an unspecified threat. His sister, according to accounts provided to investigators, had begun locking her bedroom door at night. On the evening of August 15th, Harrouff attended dinner at Duffy's Sports Grill in Jupiter with his father, sister, and a friend. Surveillance footage documented him standing from the table mid-meal and walking out of the restaurant without explanation. He went to his mother's residence, where evidence later indicated he consumed a quantity of cooking oil. His mother drove him back to the restaurant, where confrontation with his father preceded a second departure on foot. He walked more than 3 miles through the surrounding neighborhood, at some point removing his clothing. The couple whose property he ultimately reached, John Stevens III, 59, and Michelle Mishkin Stevens, 53, had no prior connection to him. Evidence later presented at proceedings indicated the couple typically kept their garage door open during evenings, using the furnished space as an informal gathering area. A chemical liquid found in the garage was also later noted as having been consumed before the attack. A neighbor, Jeff Fisher, responded to sounds of violence and attempted to intervene. Fisher sustained stab wounds and survived. When deputies arrived, they found Harrouff positioned over John Stevens. Documented accounts from the scene indicated that multiple officers, 2 deployments of an electric stun device, and a police K-9 were required to achieve separation. Harrouff screamed at deputies to shoot him and appeared, according to those accounts, entirely unresponsive to pain. He was transported to a hospital where he remained for 49 days. FBI toxicology results returned weeks later were negative for bath salts, flakka, and the other substances that had been speculated about extensively in early media coverage. Only THC was detected. The question of what had produced his condition that night fell entirely to psychiatric evaluation. Multiple forensic psychiatric assessments were conducted over the following 6 years. A state-hired psychologist, Gregory Landrum, concluded following a 5-hour evaluation that Harrouff had experienced an acute psychotic episode on the night of August 15th and had been unable to distinguish right from wrong during the attack. The defense retained an expert who reached the same essential conclusion. A third expert, retained by the state, also found criteria for legal insanity to be met, though that examiner later withdrew from testifying due to a personal health matter. In November 2022, both the prosecution and defense arrived in Martin County Circuit Court before Judge Sherwood Bauer with a jointly negotiated position. Harrouff would enter a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. No jury was seated. Judge Bauer accepted the stipulation on November 28, 2022, citing the weight of the psychiatric evidence that both parties had agreed was dispositive. Harrouff was adjudicated not guilty by reason of insanity and committed to a secure state psychiatric facility under the supervision of the Florida Department of Children and Families. Members of the victims' families delivered impact statements in open court, several of which directly addressed the legal outcome and the absence of a criminal conviction. Bauer specified that Harrouff could not leave the facility without a court order, but he remains there under secure commitment, subject to periodic review by treating physicians and the court. No determination that he no longer poses a danger to others has been made. There is no conviction, no sentence, and no release date. The fitness account that documented his public identity, the bodybuilding content, the natural training philosophy, the uploaded mixtape, still exists in the form it took before August 11th, 2016. 4 days before the night that made those posts the only record of who the world believed Austin Harrouff to be. The gap between the version of him visible on those profiles and the version documented in psychiatric evaluations and digital forensics is not a matter of moral complexity or disputed interpretation. It is a matter of chronological fact. The accounts were current, active, and unremarkable right up to the moment they stopped. After that, they became the only evidence of a life that had, in every documentable sense, already ended before the law was able to reach it. Where this case turned on a documented collapse that authorities could trace through digital evidence and psychiatric records, the next one turned on something slower and more deliberate, a hidden pattern maintained across years by someone whose public presence gave every indication of a life entirely under control. Case 5, Natalie Hodson. At 9:21 in the evening on August 9th, 2022, a witness driving northbound on Idaho Highway 55 between Beacon Light Road and Siemens Gulch Road called 911 to report a collision. The caller had observed a minivan strike a person on the roadside and continue north without stopping. The same witness followed the vehicle until it pulled over on Subtle Lake Drive, where Ada County Sheriff's deputies arrived, identified the driver, and began collecting evidence. What the responding deputies were processing at the scene was the death of a 39-year-old art and yearbook teacher from Cascade. What they were not yet aware of was that the driver, who had stopped on Subtle Lake Drive, carried more than 466,000 followers on Facebook and had posted what would become the last update to her social media accounts the previous day. Natalie Hodson grew up in the Boise area and constructed her public identity incrementally over several years, beginning with a personal blog that documented her postpartum fitness recovery, at-home workouts, nutritional content, and the kind of candid personal disclosure that tends to generate sustained audience loyalty. As her following expanded, she transitioned into online business coaching, eventually establishing herself as the chief executive of Peak Business Academy and positioning herself as a practitioner and teacher of marketing strategy and entrepreneurship. By August 2022, she maintained over 466,000 followers on Facebook, more than 85,000 on Instagram, and additional reach through a YouTube channel and a podcast. Local television outlet KTVB had profiled her in 2019 as part of a series on Treasure Valley social media personalities. She was 37 years old, a mother based in Boise. To her audience, she was the evidence that consistent effort and self-awareness produced measurable results. That was the premise her entire platform rested on. But on the day of the crash, evidence later presented in court indicated that Hodson had consumed alcoholic seltzers in the parking lot of a hospital prior to a medical appointment, then continued drinking after returning to her vehicle before driving south on Highway 55. The victim, Christina Rowley, had been in her second year, teaching art and yearbook at Cascade School District. She had pulled her pickup truck over to the side of the highway to inspect the trailer she was hauling. Her 16-year-old son was in the vehicle at the time. Rowley was standing off the road when Hodson's minivan struck her. Deputies arriving at the scene found Rowley badly injured and began first aid. Paramedics transported her to St. Alphonsus Regional Medical Center in Boise, where she was pronounced dead. When deputies interviewed Hodson at the location where the witness had followed her vehicle, she initially denied both drinking and striking anything. In a subsequent interview, she acknowledged having consumed 4 alcoholic seltzers and indicated she had believed she had struck a mailbox. Blood alcohol testing conducted hours after the crash recorded a result of 0.085, just above Idaho's legal threshold of 0.08. Prosecutors subsequently presented to the court that given the elapsed time between the collision and the recorded test, Hodson's actual blood alcohol content at the moment of impact would likely have been higher than the measured figure. Ada County court records also documented a pattern of prior traffic violations. Speeding citations found guilty in June 2010, February 2017, and as recently as March 2022, 5 months before the night in question. Hodson was charged with felony vehicular manslaughter and the additional felony of leaving the scene of an injury accident. The original not guilty plea advanced the case toward a jury trial scheduled for February 20th, 2024. Approximately 3 weeks before that date, Hodson entered a guilty plea to the vehicular manslaughter charge before 4th District Judge Lynn Norton in Ada County District Court. As part of the agreement, prosecutors dismissed the leaving the scene felony. In court, Hodson stated that she had committed a terrible crime and that no sentence could adequately address what the Rowley family had endured. Defense attorney Michael Bartlett presented context for the sentencing phase. Hodson had entered inpatient alcohol treatment, completed a month-long residential program, and attended more than 600 Alcoholics Anonymous meetings in the period following the crash. He requested placement in a community transition program. Ada County Deputy Prosecutor Brittany Ford argued that justice required a period of incarceration distinct from rehabilitation outcomes. On March 7th, 2024, Judge Norton sentenced Hodson to a maximum of 15 years in Idaho State Prison, 2 years fixed, followed by 13 years indeterminate, with parole eligibility beginning at the conclusion of the fixed 2-year term. The judge did not place her on probation contingent on future release and suspended her driver's license for 20 years. Hodson is currently serving her sentence within the Idaho Department of Correction. The witness who chose to follow the minivan northbound on Highway 55 after the collision was, in a documented sense, is the reason this case existed at all. Without that decision to follow, there was no identification at the scene, no stop on Subtle Lake Drive, and no investigation that night. It was a stranger's decision, made in the dark on a state highway, with no obligation attached, that produced the entire chain of accountability that followed. The online presence that had built an audience around discipline, accountability, and the measurable value of consistent choices went silent on August 8th, 2022, the day before Christina Rowley died on the shoulder of the highway. Her son was in the vehicle when it happened. He was 16 years old. Rowley had been preparing to begin her second year as a teacher. Those details exist in court records and in reporting, available to anyone who looked past the platform numbers and the brand language. The architecture of this case is defined entirely by that distance, between what was visible and what was true, between the version Hodson presented and the night on the highway that ended both. Where that case turned on a single night and a decision made behind the wheel, the next one unfolded across 2 years. The distance between an ideology absorbed online and a school parking lot in a Finnish village where children were present and a weapon was loaded. Case 6. Cameron Herrin. In the weeks following the sentencing hearing concluded on April 8, 2021, in a Tampa courtroom, something began to accumulate on TikTok that no court proceeding had anticipated. A clip of the moment Hillsborough County Circuit Court Judge Christopher Nash handed down a 24-year prison sentence spread across the platform, and within a period measured in days rather than weeks, the response fractured into a movement. The hashtag Justice for Cameron gathered billions of views, a figure that ultimately exceeded 2.2 billion, placing it among the most viewed criminal justice hashtags in the platform's history at that point. The movement was not primarily about the legal merits of vehicular homicide sentencing. It was, by wide analysis, primarily about the appearance of the young man standing before the judge. Cameron Herrin was born in 1999 and raised in Tampa. He attended Tampa Catholic High School, went on to Texas Tech University, and returned to the Tampa area, where he was living in his family's home on Bayshore Boulevard, the same road where, on the afternoon of May 23, 2018, he drove his 2018 Ford Mustang GT at a recorded speed exceeding 102 miles per hour, racing northbound alongside a gold Nissan Altima, driven by his 17-year-old friend, John Barrineau. He was 18 at the time. The posted speed limit on Bayshore Boulevard was 45 miles per hour. A data recorder in Herrin's vehicle captured his speed before he initiated hard braking in the moments immediately preceding the crash. The vehicle did not stop in time. Herrin's Mustang struck Jessica Reisinger Raubenolt, a 24-year-old visitor from Jeromesville, Ohio, who was pushing her 21-month-old daughter, Lilia, in a stroller across the roadway at West Knights Avenue, in what investigators determined was a lawful crossing. Jessica Reisinger Raubenolt died at the scene. Lilia was transported to a hospital and died the following day, when Herrin was arrested on the day of the crash. His passenger, his brother Tristan, was not charged. Barrineau was also taken into custody. In the investigation that followed, law enforcement documented the vehicle data recorder evidence, witness accounts confirming both vehicles' speeds, and the mechanics of the crash sequence. Prosecutors later noted that Barrineau had swerved to avoid the pedestrians. Herrin had swerved to avoid the Altima, and in doing so, struck the mother and child. Both defendants faced charges of vehicular homicide. As the case moved toward trial over the course of 2.5 years, Barrineau negotiated a plea agreement, pleading guilty to vehicular homicide charges and a misdemeanor racing charge in December 2020, receiving a sentence of 6 years in Florida State Prison, followed by 15 years of probation. Herrin entered a separate, open guilty plea to 2 counts of vehicular homicide in December 2020, electing to have Judge Nash determine his sentence rather than accept a structured agreement. At the April 8, 2021 sentencing hearing, the courtroom received extensive victim impact testimony from the families of Jessica Reisinger Raubenolt and Lilia. Testimony focused on the permanent absence the crash had placed inside their lives. Defense testimony included statements from character witnesses attesting to Herrin's qualities as a person. The state guidelines in Florida suggested a sentencing range of approximately 18 years. Herrin's defense team requested a sentence of 6 years. The victims' families requested the maximum of 30 years. A Judge Nash sentenced Herrin to 24 years in Florida State Prison, 6 years above the guideline range and 6 years below the maximum. There was no parole mechanism under the applicable Florida statute. The sentence was structured across 2 vehicular homicide counts. What happened next on TikTok became the subject of academic and journalistic analysis in its own right. The movement that emerged in defense of Herrin's sentence was driven almost entirely by commentary on his physical appearance, a phenomenon his own mother described in interviews as an unhealthy obsession. Petitions circulated. International supporters posted in multiple languages. Yet a portion of the online commentary appeared to come from users with no prior engagement with American criminal proceedings and minimal awareness of the facts of the case. Users responding to a viral clip of a young man crying as a judge read a number. What the viral clip did not convey: 2 people were dead, the speed data was in the vehicle's own recorder, and the plea had already been entered. Defense attorney John Fitzgibbons subsequently filed a motion to reduce the sentence, claiming in part that the prosecutor had indicated the sentence was excessive. Judge Nash denied the motion, noting that the state of Florida had not joined the defense's effort and that the trial court retained independent authority over sentencing. The Second District Court of Appeal upheld the 24-year sentence in May 2022. On all subsequent motions have been denied. Herrin is currently incarcerated at Graceville Correctional Facility in Graceville, Jackson County, Florida. His scheduled release date is July 8, 2044. The case has been analyzed in studies of how social media celebrity dynamics, the transfer of fan loyalty frameworks built around entertainers onto individuals appearing in criminal proceedings, can distort public perception of legal accountability in ways that bear no relationship to the documented facts of the underlying event. The road where Jessica Reisinger Raubenold was pushing her daughter across a crosswalk in a lawful crossing still carries traffic. The data recorder in the Mustang still exists in court records. The number it captured, 102 miles per hour, has not changed. What follows from here involves a different kind of platform and a different kind of accountability. A case in which the social media presence was not a backdrop to the crime, but a direct mechanism inside it. Case 7, Evita Kolmonen. In the late hours of March 14th, 2024, a former military colleague of Finnish Army Corporal Evita Kolmonen contacted police in Vasa after coming across a video Kolmonen had uploaded to a social media platform. The video was not ambiguous. In it, Kolmonen described her plans. Police reached investigators before the following morning. On March 15th, the anniversary of the 2019 Christchurch mosque shootings, Kolmonen was located and arrested in Vasa. What investigators established in the days that followed was that she had already been to the target location. She had been standing on the premises, armed, 3 days before the tip that led to her arrest. Evita Bettina Kolmonen was 23 years old at the time of her arrest and held the rank of a liikkesantti, roughly equivalent to corporal, in the Finnish Defense Forces. She had grown up in Vasa, in Western Finland, and had developed an online presence connected to communities that Finnish law enforcement later characterized as aligned with eco-fascist ideology. Digital records reviewed during criminal proceedings documented her engagement with the writings of Friedrich Nietzsche, Finnish deep ecologist Pentti Linkola, and Theodore Kaczynski, the American mathematician who had carried out a years-long domestic terrorism campaign before his 1996 arrest. She had also, according to online conversation records entered into evidence, expressed admiration for Pekka Erik Alvinen, the perpetrator of the November 7th, 2007 Jokela school shooting, which killed 8 people and remained the first mass shooting at a Finnish educational institution. Kolmonen had not merely studied Ovinen's case. She had traveled to Jokela and visited the school where the attack had occurred. The plan she had developed was not impulsive. Evidence presented before the District Court of Ostrobothnia indicated it had been constructed over approximately 2 years. The identified target was the school center in the village of Isakiro in South Ostrobothnia, approximately 50 kilometers southeast of Vasa, serving children at multiple grade levels. The timing she selected was deliberate. Prosecutors noted that she had traveled to the facility at a time calculated to maximize the number of pupils present on the premises. On March 12, 2024, Kolmonen traveled to the Isakura School Center. She arrived on the premises. She was carrying a loaded pistol in her backpack, along with ammunition, a knife, and a Molotov cocktail. According to her own account, provided during trial proceedings, she looked through the windows, observed people inside, and turned back. She returned to her vehicle and drove back to Vasa. Whether that decision constituted a genuine and permanent abandonment of the plan, or a temporary pause, became the central contested question in the legal proceedings that followed. The district court concluded it was unlikely the abandonment had been final. 2 days later, on March 14th, the video she had uploaded prompted the tip from her former colleague. When police arrested Kolmonen on March 15th, the loaded pistol was still in her backpack. Digital forensics documented the full scope of the online interactions and community engagements through which her ideology had developed, including her expressed admiration for prior mass attack perpetrators. Physical evidence from the school premises, the firearms documentation, the Molotov cocktail, and Kolmonen's own acknowledgement of her presence at Isakura, while armed, formed the core of the prosecution's case. During proceedings, a bomb threat was made against the Vasa courthouse, an external disruption that did not halt the hearings. The trial ran over 2 days before the District Court of Ostrobothnia, but Kolmonen admitted having been at the school, while armed, but maintained through her defense that her decision to turn back precluded criminal liability, arguing that voluntary abandonment of a plan before any act of violence was committed should constitute a complete defense. The court found unanimously that the evidence did not support the conclusion that her withdrawal had been permanent and final, that she had arrived at a location where children were present, in possession of lethal weapons, and had come extremely close to carrying out an attack. On June 19th, 2024, she was convicted of preparation of an aggravated offense against life and health and a firearms offense. She was sentenced to 3 years and 2 months in prison, ordered to forfeit the weapons, and stripped of her military rank. Both Kolmonen and the prosecutor filed appeals. The Vasa Court of Appeal held its main hearing on January 15th through 17th, 2025. Following those proceedings, the court issued an interim ruling ordering Kolmonen to undergo a mental health assessment before delivering a final verdict, meaning as of early 2025, the appellate outcome remained pending, and the final resolution of her case had not yet been reached. A further appeal to the Finnish Supreme Court remains a procedural possibility under Finnish law, once the appellate process concludes. This case stands as one of the very few documented instances in which a female perpetrator's radicalization path was traced directly and in forensic detail through online communities built around the glorification of prior mass attackers. Communities that operate in multiple languages, once across multiple platforms, and whose reach extends just as completely to individuals who never post publicly as to those who do. Kolmonen was not an influencer in any conventional sense. She produced no content for a general audience, cultivated no following, and maintained no public-facing persona. She was a consumer of material produced by others, ideology that moved through closed channels and private conversations, absorbed gradually, and documented only when investigators reconstructed the record after her arrest. The loaded pistol in her backpack on the Isakura school grounds was the endpoint of a process that had begun by the court's timeline roughly 2 years earlier, in online spaces that most people would never encounter. With that content traveled from a screen in Vasa to a school parking lot where children were behind the windows, and it was stopped not by a platform or a filter or an algorithm, but by a former colleague who recognized a video and made a phone call. What the next case shares is not geography or ideology, but mechanism. A public broadcast made minutes before irreversible consequences, directed not at a school, but at a Walmart parking lot 650 miles from home. Case 8, Patrick Crusius. At 10:15 on the morning of August 3rd, 2019, federal investigators examining the digital record of the mass shooting at the Cielo Vista Walmart in El Paso, Texas, identified a post uploaded to the Fringe image board 8chan approximately 22 minutes before the first shots were fired. The post opened a new thread, contained text, and attached a PDF document. That document was later identified as a manifesto. It named the target. It described the ideology. The individual who uploaded it had already driven to El Paso and was parked in the lot when he opened his laptop. By the time law enforcement was processing the post, 23 people were dead and 22 others had been wounded. Patrick Wood Crusius was born July 27, 1998, in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. He attended Plano Senior High School before enrolling at Collin College in the fall of 2017. He dropped out in the spring of 2019. He was 21 years old on August 3rd. Court records and reporting from the period preceding the attack documented a young man who had become increasingly absorbed by online political discourse centered on immigration and demographic anxiety, consuming and contributing to discussions on platforms where rhetoric about demographic replacement circulated without substantial moderation. He legally purchased a GPW ASR-10 semi-automatic rifle and 1,000 rounds of hollow point ammunition online in June 2019. That same month, his mother contacted Allen Police Department to express concern about her son's mental state and the firearms purchase. Under Texas law, because he was of legal age, there was nothing law enforcement was positioned to act upon, and defense attorneys later confirmed in court that Crusius had been diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder, a condition characterized by psychotic symptoms alongside mood disturbance, and that the delusional framework it produced had shaped the documented beliefs behind his actions. On August 3rd, 2019, Crusius drove approximately 650 miles from his home in Allen, Texas, to El Paso, a journey of roughly 10 hours. He arrived at the Cielo Vista Walmart, a large retail store in a predominantly Hispanic neighborhood near the US-Mexico border. The manifesto he uploaded to 8chan at 10:15 a.m., framed in the language of the Great Replacement conspiracy theory, described Hispanic immigration as an invasion requiring a violent response, and cited the March 2019 Christchurch mosque shootings, whose perpetrator had also circulated a manifesto online before the attack, as a reference point. At 10:37 a.m., Crusius retrieved his rifle from the vehicle and opened fire in the parking lot, then moved inside the store. Evidence presented in subsequent proceedings documented that he moved through the facility methodically. He shot 45 people. 23 died. They ranged in age from a 15-year-old high school athlete to multiple grandparents, and included both American residents and Mexican nationals who had crossed the border for routine shopping. The FBI investigated the attack as an act of domestic terrorism and characterized it as the deadliest act of anti-Hispanic violence in modern American history. Crusius surrendered to officers at a nearby intersection and confirmed to them, according to an arrest warrant affidavit, that he was the shooter. The legal process unfolded across two separate tracks, federal and state, over nearly 6 years. On February 8, 2023, in the federal case, Crusius entered a guilty plea to all 90 federal charges, encompassing hate crimes resulting in death, use of a firearm to commit murder, hate crimes involving attempted killing, and related weapons offenses. On July 7, 2023, U.S. District Judge David Guadarrama sentenced him to 90 consecutive life terms in federal prison and recommended placement at the federal Supermax facility in Florence, Colorado. 3 days of victim impact statements preceded the sentence. The federal death penalty was not sought. Prosecutors acknowledged Crusius's diagnosed mental illness as a factor in that determination, while emphasizing the documented planning that preceded the attack. In the state case, Crusius had been indicted on capital murder charges and had maintained a not guilty plea through the tenures of 3 successive El Paso district attorneys. In late March 2025, the 4th DA, James Montoya, announced the state would offer a plea arrangement removing the death penalty in exchange for a guilty plea. A decision Montoya stated was driven primarily by the expressed preference of a majority of victims' families, who wanted the proceedings concluded without a prolonged trial. On April 21, 2025, Crusius entered guilty pleas in 409th District Court before Judge Sam Medrano to 23 counts of capital murder and 22 counts of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon enhanced with a bias and prejudice finding. Judge Medrano sentenced him to 23 life terms in state prison without the possibility of parole, running concurrently with his federal sentences. Before closing the proceedings, Medrano addressed Crusius directly, stating that his mission had failed, that he had not divided El Paso, and that the city he targeted had become a symbol of resilience. Crusius made no statement and showed no visible reaction throughout the proceedings. He is currently pending transfer into the Texas state prison system. The 8chan thread he opened at 10:15 a.m. on August 3, 2019, still exists in archived form. It preceded the shooting by 22 minutes and named the target, described the ideology, and cited a prior attack conducted the same way. A public broadcast posted to a community of readers before the first shot was fired. The victims ranged from a 15-year-old athlete to grandparents who had crossed an international border to shop on a routine morning. Several were Mexican nationals. Several were American residents who had lived in El Paso for decades. None of them were involved in the grievances documented in the manifesto. None of them knew the document existed. The mechanism that made this case possible was not private communication or carefully concealed planning executed in isolation. It was a post addressed to a community, time-stamped and archived and readable by anyone who knew where to look. And it was read. By the time the investigation was complete, the 45 people had been shot on a Saturday morning in a retail parking lot, and the man responsible had surrendered at a nearby intersection and confirmed what he had done. The next case turns the mechanism entirely inward. Not a broadcast directed outward to a community of readers, but surveillance directed at one specific person, installed in secret, used to monitor a woman who had already decided to leave. Case 9. Ali Abulaban. The first indication that something had occurred inside Unit 3, 502 of the Spire San Diego apartments came at 3:07 in the afternoon on October 21st, 2021, when building security logged an entry on the 35th floor, and elevator footage captured a man in a baseball cap sprinting down the hallway from the elevator doors toward the unit he had vacated weeks earlier. A 911 call followed within seconds of that sprint ending. By the time San Diego Police Department officers arrived, Ana Abulaban, 28, and Rayburn Cardenas Barron, 29, had both been shot in the face on the living room couch. Both were transported from the scene. Neither survived. The man who had entered the apartment, Ali Abulaban, was located by investigators a short time later. He did not deny having fired the shots. Abulaban was born in Staten Island and had served in the United States Air Force, where he was stationed in Okinawa, Japan. It was there that he met Ana, who was originally from the Philippines. They married and eventually relocated to San Diego so that Abulaban could pursue opportunities in the entertainment industry, a goal that by 2020 and 2021 had found its vehicle in TikTok. Is where he developed a persona called Jin Kid, built primarily on celebrity impressions and comedic character sketches. His most viewed content centered on his impression of Tony Montana from the 1983 film Scarface. a character he performed with enough fidelity to generate a following that would grow to nearly 1 million accounts before the events of October 2021 ended his public presence entirely. The content was energetic, performed, and crowd-responsive. It gave no indication of the circumstances developing in the same San Diego apartment where some of it was filmed, with Anna occasionally appearing on camera beside him. Those circumstances, as laid out by prosecution evidence and corroborated by Abulaban's own testimony during trial, included a documented history of coercive control and physical violence within the marriage, in a deepening cocaine addiction. Abulaban had acknowledged publicly on social media, and a period of escalating conflict that had preceded a separation. By October 2021, Anna and their young daughter were living in the Spire apartment without him. He had been removed from the residence. Abulaban had obtained a duplicate key to the unit before he left. He had also, prosecutors established, installed a spyware application on the iPad belonging to their young daughter, which allowed him to monitor audio from inside the apartment remotely. On October 21st, 2021, using that application, he heard Anna and Baron talking and laughing together. Within minutes, he was in his car and driving to the Spire. Building security footage documented the rest with timestamps. Abulaban took the elevator to the 35th floor. He sprinted down the corridor. He entered the apartment with the duplicate key. According to the prosecution's reconstruction, supported by audio recordings that Abulaban had apparently activated on his own phone immediately before entering, the first gunshots were captured on those recordings approximately 1 second after the door opened. Abulaban shot Baron 3 times. He shot Anna in the head. He then photographed the bodies and transmitted the image to his mother. He called 911 shortly afterward. When police located him, a firearm was recovered. He admitted to pulling the trigger. The trial, which began May 1st, 2024, in San Diego Superior Court, ran for nearly a month and included 3 days during which Abulaban took the stand in his own defense. The prosecution's theory was premeditation and coercive control, that Abulaban had installed the spyware specifically to surveil Anna, that he had retained the duplicate key as a means of access, and that the decision to drive to the apartment and enter it armed constituted planning rather than impulse. Defense attorney Jody Green argued for voluntary manslaughter, that Abulaban, confronted with a sight he had not anticipated, had experienced an overwhelming emotional reaction that negated the premeditation required for first-degree murder. In testimony, Abulaban described seeing Anna and Baron together and feeling that something took over before he could stop himself. The jury heard the elevator footage, the audio recordings, the digital trail from the surveillance app, evidence of prior domestic incidents, and the photographs sent to his mother. The prosecution also presented records of internet searches Abulaban had conducted. Jurors deliberated for approximately a day and a half. On May 29th, 2024, they returned verdicts of guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder. The jury also found special circumstance allegations of multiple murders to be true, a finding that, under California law, mandated a sentence of life without the possibility of parole. At the sentencing hearing on September 6th, 2024, before San Diego Superior Court Judge Jeffrey Fraser, victim impact statements were delivered by the families of both Anna and Baron, statements that described absences now measured in years and losses that would not resolve. Abulaban addressed the court for approximately 10 minutes. Like when Judge Fraser delivered his sentence, 2 consecutive terms of 25 years to life, constituting life without the possibility of parole. The gallery responded with applause. Fraser stated that he had serious reservations about the authenticity of any remorse Abulaban had expressed, that Abulaban was, in the judge's assessment, a profoundly selfish person, and that the bottom line was uncomplicated. He would die in prison. He would take his last breath there. Abulaban has since filed an appeal of his conviction, arguing from prison that the jury's deliberation period was insufficient and that the evidence supported a finding of heat of passion rather than premeditation. A Peacock documentary titled TikTok Star Murders had already been produced about the case before the sentencing concluded. His appeal is ongoing. What the surveillance app on his daughter's iPad was the mechanism that triggered everything that followed. A piece of technology installed not for entertainment and not for public consumption, but for private monitoring of a woman who had tried to leave. The next case is the last one, and it involves a different kind of watching. Not surveillance of someone close, but the silent study of strangers. People whose public social media profiles were examined, revisited, and eventually used as coordinates. Case 10, Bryan Kohberger. At approximately 4 a.m. on November 13th, 2022, in a residential neighborhood 2 blocks from the University of Idaho campus in Moscow, Idaho. 4 students were killed inside an off-campus rental house on King Road. The killings were not discovered until later that morning. It's when surviving housemates, 2 of whom had been asleep in the building during the attack, began attempting to reach their roommates and eventually called 911. When investigators arrived, they found the bodies of Kaylee Goncalves, age 21, Madison Mogan, age 21, Zana Kernodle, age 20, and Ethan Chapin, age 20. Kernodle's boyfriend, Chapin, had been visiting the house that night. All 4 had been stabbed. A leather sheath, later identified as belonging to a fixed-blade knife, had been left behind on the bed near one of the victims. Bryan Christopher Kohberger was born on November 21, 1994, in Broadheadsville, Pennsylvania. He pursued an academic path that moved methodically through the study of human behavior and criminal systems. An associate degree in psychology, a bachelor's in psychology, a master's in criminal justice, it all obtained at institutions in Pennsylvania, before arriving at Washington State University in Pullman, Washington, in the summer of 2022 to begin a doctoral program in criminology. WSU's campus in Pullman sits less than 8 miles west of Moscow, Idaho, across the state line. Kohberger had completed his first semester of the doctoral program 9 days before his arrest. To the people who interacted with him academically, he was described as highly intelligent, occasionally antagonistic, and intensely interested in the relationship between criminal behavior and the psychological patterns that produced it. He had no documented prior criminal history. There was nothing in the public record that pointed in any particular direction. There was, however, a digital record. Investigators working the Moscow case in the weeks following the November 13th killings developed a suspect profile that incorporated physical evidence, surveillance footage, and cellular location data. Security cameras had captured a white Hyundai Elantra in the vicinity of the house on King Road on multiple occasions in the weeks before the attack, and again on the night of the killings. That vehicle was registered to Kohberger. Phone records placed his device near the King Road house on at least a dozen occasions prior to November 13th. Investigators also obtained a DNA sample through investigative genetic genealogy techniques applied to material recovered from family members' discarded items that was subsequently matched to the DNA profile recovered from the knife sheath left at the scene. The match connected the sheath to Kohberger with a degree of specificity that the court later determined did not violate his constitutional rights. On December 30th, 2022, law enforcement arrested him at his family's home in Monroe County, Pennsylvania, where he had traveled during the university's winter break. He was extradited to Idaho and charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of felony burglary. The burglary charge arising from his unlawful entry into the house with intent to commit a crime. What emerged during years of pre-trial proceedings was, among other details, the documented pattern of Kohberger's digital engagement with the victims before the killings. Investigators established that he had been following the public Instagram profiles of at least one victim and had followed and then unmatched with her on a social application prior to November 13th, and that his cell phone placed him physically near the house repeatedly over the preceding weeks in a pattern that prosecutors characterized as surveillance. The victims were college students with normal public social media presences, content visible to anyone who looked. Nothing about their profiles or their routines flagged the attention they had attracted. The person observing them was invisible. He was not following them in any recognizable sense. He was a graduate student in the academic study of crime, examining the people he had apparently selected from a distance, using the same platforms his intended victims used to stay connected with their friends. Kohberger had maintained a not guilty plea through 3 years of extensive pre-trial litigation that included multiple defense motions challenging the death penalty, the admissibility of the genetic genealogy evidence, and the ability to mount an alternate perpetrator theory. All were ultimately denied. The case was moved from Latah County to Ada County in Boise, after the court determined that pre-trial publicity and public statements from local officials had made a fair jury selection in the original venue untenable. On July 2nd, 2025, as the trial date of August 18th approached and jury selection in Boise was imminent, Kohberger entered guilty pleas to all 5 charges: 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of felony burglary, as part of an agreement under which prosecutors withdrew the death penalty notice. As he also waived his right to appeal, a provision that made the outcome final and unreviewable. He did not provide a statement of allocution at sentencing. He said nothing about why. On July 23, 2025, Ada County District Court Judge Stephen Hippler sentenced Kohberger to 4 consecutive fixed life terms in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 10 years for burglary. Hippler noted from the bench that Kohberger's motive might never be known, that even if compelled to speak, there was no mechanism to ensure what he said would be true. He told the courtroom that the time had come to end Kohberger's 15 minutes of fame. Kohberger, seated in an orange prison uniform and shackled, declined to address the court when offered the opportunity. He showed no visible reaction to the impact statements delivered by the families of his victims or the surviving roommates who described what remained of their lives after November 13th, 2022. He is currently housed in solitary confinement at the Idaho Maximum Security Institution in Kuna, Idaho, where he will remain without possibility of release for the rest of his life. He had studied crime academically. He had read the research, attended the seminars, engaged with the literature that attempts to explain what drives people to the actions he ultimately committed. And then he drove 8 miles across a state line in the dark, entered a house through an unlocked sliding door, and killed 4 people who had not known he existed. People whose faces he had studied on public social media profiles. In the weeks before he arrived at the place where they lived,